My name is Iwan Marantika. I'm coming out of the lab studio of University of Gajah Mada School of Medicine, in which today we are discussing a very, very crucial issue in the university realm or in the university sector, in which the Indonesian Australian Business Council, partnering with Western Sydney University and the University of Gajah Mada School of Medicine, will be conducting. And as we all know, we are in the era of COVID-19. And so as many leaders, and this is basically what this forum is, the participants here are university leaders and people who make decisions for universities. As university leaders they ponder the question in this era of COVID-19 in Shakespearean tradition. Woe is me, woe is me. What about our university? To be or not to be, what is the fate of the university? So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the issue of this virtual dialogue today. And as Pa Afard has shared with us, we have a very distinguished speakers to discuss this issue. This is an intellectual tradition. This isn't a free flow discussion. It's an open discussion in which it will be a precursor to many, many thinking and ideas that will be coming out of the Great Reset of COVID-19 in the higher education sector. And so with that, the Indonesian Australian Business Council is honored to have within our board of advisors the representative of the Australian Embassy. We have with us here today Todd Diaz, Councillor Todd Diaz from the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. And with that, I'd like the Councillor of the Australian Embassy from Jakarta, Mr. Todd Diaz, to be able to provide opening remarks to open this dialogue. Please, Pak Todd, this Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to be here. Selamat pagi for those of you in Indonesia, and selamat siang if you're joining us from Australia. I'm really delighted to be part of the board of IABC as an advisor and really pleased to be joining you today. But George, I didn't know you would be quoting Shakespeare. So if I'd known that, I would have prepared perhaps a few quotes of my own. But the fate of the university, it seems quite dire. Hopefully we'll have some positive interventions this morning. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief, but starting off on a positive note, it's really true that education is central to the bilateral relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And over the time that I've been working on Australia-Indonesia relations, it's really noticeable how that education relationship has grown. As George said, I'm the head of the economic trade and investment team in the embassy, which means that I don't necessarily quote Shakespeare, but I do like statistics. And the statistic I have for you today is that education is actually the #1 export from Australia to Indonesia. And the latest statistics that we have are for the financial year in Australia. So it's 2019-2020, so up to the end of June 2020. And education accounted for $988 million worth of trade. So that's primarily Indonesian students coming to Australia to study. And interestingly, that number is $45 million higher than the previous financial year. Now, I have to admit I was scratching my head because, of course, COVID hit us all in 2020. But I guess it makes sense because the majority of students would have already arrived in Australia for the 2020 academic year before border restrictions were in place and shutdown measures were imposed on our societies, both in Indonesia and in Australia. And in fact, I was checking for my education colleagues, and they tell me that almost 14,000 Indonesian students are in Australia. Well, this is a stat from December. So they were in Australia as of December 2020. So it's a huge number of Indonesian students that are currently in country and happily going on with their education experience, which is great. I do fear for this statistic in coming years though, so we'll see how we go with that. But in some other positive news, the other part of the section that I work on is of course trade. And the big part of our 2020 experience was the entry into force of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, most people think about that in terms of, how much more agricultural product will we send to Indonesia and how many more manufactured goods will come from Indonesia to Australia. But of course, on the services side and on the investment side, it is quite significant. And one of the things that I note is that it really has shone a spotlight on the opportunities for collaboration in the education sector. So we're seeing more and more Australian universities look at opportunities, for example, to open campuses in Indonesia, which hopefully will be made a little bit easier through these reforms in the omnibus law on job creation, particularly in areas like special economic zones. But we're also looking at collaborations between universities as well, whether that's not necessarily opening up bricks and mortar campuses, but collaborations across programs and sharing of students. In fact, I understand that there's almost over 300 collaborations between Australian academic institutions and Indonesian academic institutions, which is just terrific. And we absolutely want that to grow. But of course, this webinar is all about the future of universities, as George so dramatically introduced just then, and the fate of universities. And much of that sits around the fate of these campuses, these really big, expensive pieces of infrastructure designed to teach people and let people grow academically. And at the beginning of this year, I had the pleasure of joining an online webinar with some students from the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies. Now, I have to admit that I am extremely biased as someone who's gone through that program several decades ago. And I had the honor of spending a semester of my academic career at UGM. So I'm very pleased that we've been joined by academics from UGM today. I feel like it's my home campus. And this webinar was a group of young Australians who would normally be coming up to Indonesia to do internships. And unfortunately, because of the travel restrictions, they were not able to do that. So they were doing these virtual internships. And we were having a really good discussion about the relationship and what it's like and what we can do to improve it. And one of the things that I mentioned there was that whilst these Zoom rooms, these virtual meetings are really terrific at bringing people together in a very cost-efficient way, and it's very easy to do, we are missing that face-to-face interaction. And as I told that group of Achicha students, my favorite semester of my 5 years at university was the semester that I spent at UGM. That's no disrespect to my campus in Sydney, but it was just so much fun interacting with Indonesian students, whilst also learning from the academic side as well. And I really do hope that whatever the future holds for universities, obviously as we go through COVID, but also in the post-COVID world, that face-to-face interaction continues. And whether it's a mix of online learning with face-to-face learning, or as I did some semester exchanges overseas, it really does enrich the student learning. And that's something that I've drawn on throughout my entire career since undertaking my academic studies. And it's really served me well. And I do hope that future generations will have that equal opportunity to build those people-to-people links and really understand a culture. It's not just about the academic learning, it's about the entire culture of what you get. Now, I'm talking about UGM and my experience in Yogyakarta, but that's the same issue as if you were studying in your home university. So those enriching experiences that you have on campus, as opposed to just the learning in the classroom. So George, I don't want to spend too much time. I know we've got a lot of really interesting speakers, so I'm very interested in hearing what they have to say. But once again, thank you very much for inviting me along. It's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to hearing some very wise discussions from our colleagues from Western Sydney University. And of course, my favorite university, no offense, James, Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. So thanks, George. With that, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Councillor Todd, for those opening remarks. So you're an alumni of University of Gadjah Mada. Very good. Alumni here, Dr.
Yeah.
Andre. And so, thank you for those remarks. And as you accurately presented that obviously between Australia and Indonesia, education is a main pillar of the bilateral relations. And we hope one day you'll be able to come back here to Yogyakarta. Yeah. And so thank you, Pak Todd Diaz, representing the Australian Embassy, and thank you for your continuous support and the Australian Embassy support on the IABC. Thank you. And now we have, for the next discussion, a very well-known academic and intellectual from Australia, Professor Dr. James of Ranitakis. I believe you're probably from Greek heritage. Is that true, Professor
That's
James? Yes.
That's correct.
Yes. And Professor James is not just the pro vice chancellor of Western Sydney University, but a very well known sociologist and an intellectual. And in Australia, especially, many times covered by the electronic media, TV media in Australia, and has done a lot of very interesting research, published a book on the future of the university and the citizen scholar, and also has published recently research regarding the impact on COVID-19 and the trust towards experts. So this is a very, very interesting issue. And it's impacted globally, and including here. I'm sitting in the lab, teaching lab of the experts, the public experts, public health experts, actually. We're at the public health school here. So that would be a very interesting finding that you can share with us. But in regards to this, again, Professor James from the Western Sydney University, we thank you for being able to participate in this virtual dialogue. The Zoom room is yours, Professor James.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you for your hard work in bringing together this discussion. Todd, it's wonderful to meet you virtually, and I look forward to hopefully sharing a cup of coffee with you in Jakarta. Professor Dr. Ova and Professor Dr. Andres, I look forward to our discussion. Selamat pagi, everyone in Indonesia. I am going to discuss for about the next 10 minutes. I want to give some broad overview and discussions and ideas, and I'm happy to, during the discussion, get into it deeper. I'm also happy to provide, I have a series of presentations and slides, but I want this to be a discussion rather than using all those, but I'm happy to provide them if anyone is interested. Or expand on any areas that are appropriate. So let me begin by saying that in 2016, so 5 years ago, I gave a presentation on the future of universities. And that presentation was a keynote presentation. It was attended by about 400 people. And when I spoke at that conference, I outlined that universities had 5 specific challenges. The first challenge was decreasing budgets. There was an increasing level of pressure put on them, bigger demands, the need to ensure that they stayed abreast of the latest technologies, and the students demanding value for money. The second challenge was technology. What's the balance between an on a face-to-face or a building campus and a cloud campus? What's the balance? Thirdly, there was the issue of competition, the rise of private providers, and we talked about the rise of organizations such as Google providing training and education. We've seen LinkedIn take on significant sections of the market, and many other providers. And I talked about how this was a trend that was going to continue and challenge universities, especially universities like Western Sydney and other Australian universities, and UGM and others that tried to be full service. That was going to be a problem. The fourth challenge I talked about was the changing nature of trust in our society, and I talked about how we had, with the internet and technologies, the rising levels of misinformation, rumors, and distrust. And the fifth element I talked about was certain global tensions, geopolitical tensions that would impact on our ability and our models to service our communities. And that also changed the expectations of what the role was in universities in society. So 5 years on, I will say that if I was starting from the beginning, I would probably talk about exactly the same 5 things. The only thing that's really changed has been the impact of a global pandemic. Now, this is in no means an insignificant impact. This is a huge impact. But in many ways, what COVID-19 has done is increased the rate of change, the pace of change that we were being confronting over the last decade, possibly two decades, around issues of trust, technology, changing expectations, and pressures on budgets, as governments are less likely to, I suppose, have less money to share amongst all sorts of public goods, including universities. So this is the environment that we're in now. But what COVID has done, as I said, is just sped up that process, just brought it forward. And it's done this in a way that has really taken us, I suppose, in some ways by surprise, but in other ways we adapted very quickly. And just going back to Todd's point, I mean, a year ago, if we were sitting here and I said that virtual internships were going to be popular amongst students, that virtual placements were going to work, we would have all sort of said, oh, it's a good idea, but maybe in 10 years. But that's something that we applied, adopted, and I know at Western Sydney University, those students that have experienced them have spoken incredibly highly about the positive impact. So COVID has had this massive impact on budgets. It's had this massive impact on the way that we're forced to deliver. It's made us think about the relationship between our cloud campuses and our virtual delivery and our physical delivery. But we shouldn't only look at it from a negative perspective. What COVID has shown, and what many of the other challenges universities have shown, and this is my moment of optimism, is that education remains such an important social, political, and economic for us, for our countries, for our citizens, for the people, for people in our communities, and universities serve a very, very specific and important function in our society. And so even though universities have been challenged and will continue to be challenged, is my internet okay? I'm getting unstable messages here. It's okay, George?
Yeah. You were
Yep,
you were a bit delayed, but you're okay
great.
now.
Great. Yeah, so even though we're facing these challenges, I'd like to talk in an optimistic way. In some ways, what our students have learned and what we've learnt is how to work across the world online in teams in real time. And that is not a negative thing. That's an incredibly positive thing. It means that if I want to have a meeting now, I'm much more comfortable having a 2-day workshop in Sydney with someone in Jakarta or Yogyakarta or somewhere else in the world. I don't feel that I have to spend the whole week going back and forth, traveling, making plans and all that. And even though I enjoy that process, it's good to see friends and family and be with people across the world. It's also shown a level of flexibility that I think has been both great for us, and it's also given our students a new level of flexibility. So we shouldn't ever waste a good crisis. And so what I would like to propose are 4 solutions to the challenges. This is the optimism I'm sharing with you is not one that dismisses the challenges. The challenges are real and they're there and we need to respond to. And COVID is not the only challenge. So what do we do? Well, I'd like to propose 4 alternatives or four responses. The first is to understand that there is a different social contract between universities and society. What's expected of universities today is much different to what was expected of universities a year before the crisis, the pandemic, but also 10 years ago. So one of the things that we really need to do, a part of that social contract, is understand that we need to rebuild trust or ensure that we have positive trust between us and our communities around us, including governments, decision makers, our students, and the communities. And that means that we need to be better at communicating, at sharing our knowledge, at sharing our ideas. So that's one. The second one is to think about having a listening project. That is, clearly understanding what those expectations are. Different partners, different stakeholders have clear expectations. Now we need to understand those, but not just accept them, need to challenge them. And here's one example. A lot of industries say that they want our students to be job ready. Well, I think our students not only need to be job ready, they need to be career ready. So it's not just about training them for one job, but actually giving them the deep critical thinking skills and soft skills to be able to adapt as industries change, because we know industries are constantly changing. Industries are merging and splitting. New industries are forming. Old industries are withering. So we need to our students not to be tied to any one industry, but to have the skills to adapt to that changing environment. Which takes me to the third point, which is that simultaneously universities need to make sure that they look forward into the changing nature of our societies, but also backwards into why universities were formed, the foundations. And this is what George mentioned before about my work on the Citizen Scholar Program. Universities do not only produce high quality scholars, but also citizens with a sense of social responsibility to their communities, to their to their nations, to their their families and those around them. This is the idea of the citizen scholar, that we need to prepare. We need excellent citizenship as excellent scholarship, as well as a commitment to being citizens. And the fourth one is to make sure that we do get that balance between an online or a virtual environment and face-to-face. Our students want a university experience. While online offers flexibility and in some ways offers many benefits, our students tell us very clearly in all the work that I've done that they still want to gather and have a life-changing experience. They want to meet people from other cultures and understand them. They want to travel to other cultures and be embedded and learn in the way that Todd spoke about. This is important, that we don't get caught up that virtual is the only way. If we do that, then what we do is we will have a lost opportunity to build those friendships, those connections, and those deep-rooted cultural understandings are so fundamental when we look at the future challenges that both our nations face. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy when the time is right to take any questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Professor James. Very interesting input that you've shared with us. 5 challenges and 4 responses. Decreasing focus, online, offline, competition, global tension, and the role of the university. Those are 5 challenges. And the 4 responses, this is very interesting, a different social contract. I think this is something that between Australia and Indonesia, we can begin to explore on the thinking behind what is that social contract of the future. And listening to stakeholders, very, very interesting. Listening to stakeholders, we need to listen more to get it right. And obviously, the role of the citizen scholar and blended learning will probably be what you see as the balance, yeah, of what the fate of the university will be. So this is obviously very, very significant input, Professor James. I think this round of discussion will be a beginning of a succession of discussions that the thinking behind all of this between Australia and Indonesia, and obviously yourself coming out of Western Sydney University, and the stakeholders here can begin to then evolve what is the thinking behind that. And so again, Professor James Avranitakis, thank you again for your input. And obviously we will get into a panel discussion with you.